Yeah, good afternoon, fellow faculty colleagues and students. Yeah, very good afternoon to all of you. I wish to thank Professor Narayanamurthy and Professor Samir Mandal for requesting me to give this talk. So it was very nice of them to request me. I hope at the end of the day, you will also get enlightened on some of these major contributions by these two stalwarts of climate science researchers. So without much ado, I would, are you able to share, see the screen?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. So the brief overview would be, I'll just very touch upon what's weather and climate, very briefly touch upon climate variability and climate change. And then I will quickly go to the contributions of Professor Manabe and Professor Hazelman. But then before I go to the contributions, I'll have to introduce some background material, which I will duly do so. So let's start. All of us know what is weather, what is climate. Weather is basically the state of the atmosphere at any particular time at a particular place. So it refers to the conditions of the atmosphere over a short period of time. So this short period of time can be from a few minutes to a days. So climate essentially refers to the average weather at a place over a time duration of many years. So these are all definitions all of you know. I always try to give one example which distinguishes weather and climate. Let's assume that somebody from very hot Chennai is invited to attend, let's say, maybe official meeting somewhere in Shimla, let's say during around Christmas. Yeah. So obviously, okay. Let's assume that some young student is participating in some national tournament. Let's say tennis tournament, which is played in Shimla. Now this boy is just 15-year-old. He's a high school student, and obviously his parents are a little tensed. They are worried what he will be getting to wear. So the parents look up typically to see what sort of clothing he should wear in order to get familiarized with the conditions at Shimla. So they carefully talk to people who are from north, or maybe they possibly Google, and then they prepare a set of dress for their son to make this trip to Shimla. So essentially, what they pack in their suitcase for their son refers to the climate. So it may so happen that this 15-year-old boy, when he lands up in Shimla, obviously it goes without saying that his suitcase will be packed with very warm clothing. You know, that sort of clothing which is typically would keep him warm, considering the conditions at Shimla. But the moment he lands, the 15-year-old boy may get to see that he will possibly not have to wear what has been packed for him, at least for an extended period of time, because it looks very sunny. I mean, and so obviously the clothes that the parents have packed in his suitcase represent the climate, and what the 15-year-old boy gets to wear in Shimla refers to the weather. So that in a nutshell distinguishes what is weather and what is climate. I'm sure all of you have this sense, but I thought this sort of simple example would highlight the differences between them. So as we all know, the climate system, or sometimes we call it the Earth system, consists of 5 components: the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, which is the ocean, the cryosphere, that is the ice. Then we have the land surface of the lithosphere, and then we have the life, plant life, human life, and all, which is called the biosphere. So the climate system is basically continuously changing due to interactions between the various components. We know the atmosphere interacts with the ocean interacts with the atmosphere interacts with the land surface, the atmosphere interacts with the cryosphere, then we have land surface interacting with biosphere. And so all these 5 components continuously interact with one another. And they are also subject to variations in the external factors like volcanic eruptions or the variations in the solar output Then obviously we have the human induced factors, like change in the atmospheric composition. Like we all know about the increase of carbon dioxide in the last 1 to 3 years, and then changes in the land use. So we all know that we have, deforestation is happening. The land cover is continuously getting changed, and so these sort of things will also impact. So that is just before I quickly go to my main topic.
Voice is muted, I think, no?
I can't hear anything.
Yeah. Voice is
I'm
muted,
sorry.
Chandrasekhar.
Yeah. Okay. Now can you hear?
Yeah.
Yes,
Now you
yes,
have to
yes.
start with climate variability and
Yeah.
climate change.
So yeah, climate variability can have both signs. Like for example, you can have, like for example, southern India or Kerala getting excessive rain during the northeast monsoon in the last decade. Okay, that would refer to something like a climate variability. But so I can say we have anomalies of rainfall in the northeast season in the last decade. These anomalies can be both positive in a sense that we have increased rainfall during the month of October, November, or we can also have anomalies can be negative in the sense that you can be having decreasing rainfall in the last 1 decade. So the climate variability has both the signs. Whereas when we talk of climate change, this refers to a systematic and statistically significant variation in either the mean state of climate or its variability. Like one example that I can immediately think of is the global warming or the warming of the planet Earth because of increasing carbon dioxide. So when you talk of climate change, typically this is of a much larger time span, like duration. So typically this can be seen for an extended period, typically decades or longer. That's one characteristic that distinguishes climate change and climate variability. The other one is that which is not highlighted, but that is also really true. Climate change typically has only one sign. So either we can have warming, so due to like increased carbon dioxide, that's definitely an example of a climate change. So again, climate change can be due to natural resources or can be anthropogenic and okay, what affects global climate? Global climate depends on, basically we all know that it's the energy from sun that drives all circulations in the atmosphere, ocean, and so that's the most important energy input to the entire climate system of the earth. So global climate typically depends on how much the sun's energy is retained in the atmosphere, in the oceans, and in the land. So as far as atmosphere is concerned, we know we have the greenhouse gases. Examples of them are carbon dioxide, water vapor. These are two most dominant greenhouse gases. So typically they are transparent to the incoming solar radiation from the sun, but typically absorb the radiation radiated by the earth, the infrared part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And then because all absorbers are also emitters, they also emit some of the radiation that they absorb, and thereby increasing the surface temperature of the planet. So we know about the greenhouse gases. So the increasing amounts of greenhouse gases can possibly impact global climate. Then we also have the presence of ozone in the stratosphere. We know ozone plays a very, very important role in that it sort of absorbs all incoming ultraviolet radiation, something from 0.2 micrometer to 0.31 micrometer from the initial incident solar radiation. and thereby actually it prevents this harmful ultraviolet radiation from reaching the Earth's surface, and then causing lot of health issues for humankind. So obviously the ozone in the stratosphere also plays a very important role. Now, if there is a depletion of ozone in the stratosphere, obviously we have concerns. Now, all of you know that about 30, 40 years back, we have the supersonic commercial flights that were planned to be flown. And typically the supersonic flights will have to fly in the stratosphere. And some of those things that emanate from this supersonic aircraft would possibly contain what are known as CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, that can actually kill ozone and cause depletion of the ozone. Because of that, the supersonic flights were actually cancelled. I mean, you don't get commercial aircraft flying in the stratosphere anymore. Then, of course, the clouds reflect incoming solar radiation. They also absorb the Earth's radiation. So they play a very important role in the radiative aspects of the Earth's atmospheric system. Then we also have aerosols. Now, aerosols interact with the incoming and the outgoing radiation. They can scatter radiation. They can also absorb incoming solar radiation. And they also play a very important role. Then the most important role played by is the water vapor. Now we know that the temperatures in the Earth's atmosphere are such that water can exist in all its three phases, in vapor phase, in liquid phase, as well as in ice phase. Now we also know that there are enormous changes of latent heat that gets released in the atmosphere when a change of phase happens from the vapor phase to the liquid phase and liquid phase to the solid phase. So this contributes to the energetics of the atmosphere and play a very important crucial role. As far as the oceans are concerned, we know that oceans are huge thermal reservoir. They store huge amounts of heat energy, and they also transport large amounts of energy. Now we all know that in low latitudes near the equator, so we have a surplus of radiant energy, and at high latitudes near the poles we have a deficit of radiant energy. So this sort of situation cannot continue. There has to be some means by which the energy from the regions of radiation surplus to be transported to the regions of radiation deficit. That means there must be a transport of heat affected from low latitudes to high latitudes. This is partly done by the circulation in the atmosphere, the well-known Hadley circulation, and also eddies in the mid latitudes. It is also, this excess heat is also transported by oceanic circulations. So the oceans not only store heat, they also transport large amount of heat. They take warm waters from near equatorial regions to high latitudes near the surface, and at the ocean bottom they actually transport colder waters from high latitudes to near equatorial regions. So the oceans play a very important role. In fact, 50% of the transport of surplus heat is affected by oceans, and the remaining 50% by the atmosphere. Now, cryosphere plays a very important role because we have this concept of albedo, which is simply the ratio of the amount of radiation that is reflected back to the incident radiation. So typically, cryosphere, which is like ice has a very high albedo, something like 0.8 to 0.9%. So 80 to 90% of the incoming solar radiation gets reflected. And again, it will depend on whether it's a fresh ice, fresh snow, or it's like older snow, and so on and so forth. However, these have very high albedos. So the amount of heat that is reflected from this ice is also very large. And so what happens is the amount that is actually absorbed and not reflected is quite small, especially when you have large extent of sea ice. And because of that, what happens is some of this energy that is absorbed by the ice surface, some of that will partly be taken up to like melt the ice, and so the amount available to heat the overlying atmosphere becomes that much less. So typically temperatures are quite low where you have this ice plays a very important role. Ice also plays an important role in the deep ocean circulation, so that I will not touch upon right now. Then we all know that land, especially soil moisture, soil temperature, these actually control the amount of sensible heat flux and the latent heat flux, and so vegetation and soil control how the energy is actually returned back to the atmosphere from the land surface. We also have biosphere. Vegetation stores significant amounts of carbon, and then it plays a very, very critical role in the photosynthesis reaction. This is just a small sort of schematic diagram which tells you about, so we have the atmosphere, we have clouds in the atmosphere, we have clouds that are not precipitating, we have clouds that are precipitating, then we have mountains, we have volcanic activity, then we also have oceans, then we have ice over the ocean, sea ice over the ocean. So you have interaction taking place between the atmosphere and the land, interaction taking place between the atmosphere and the ocean, interaction taking place between the atmosphere and the ice, and then interaction taking place between atmosphere and biosphere, and also interaction taking place between atmosphere and land surface. So whenever you have changes in land use, whenever you have changes in the cryosphere, the extent of sea ice, whenever you have changes in the ocean circulation, so whenever you have changes in the atmosphere in terms of its composition, whenever you have changes in the hydrology cycle, all of this can impact. So as I told you, all the 5 elements are continuously getting interacted through the climate system. So this is another simple schematic. So in the center you have the atmosphere, you have the ocean hydrosphere, then you have cryosphere, sea, then you have land sphere, lithosphere, and then the biosphere. And then the causes of climate variability and change can be external. So you can have changes in the Earth's orbit, you can have changes in the solar output, then you can have anthropogenic forcings. You can also have climate variations due to internal responses. You can have changes in the ice, changes in vegetation, changes in the land use, changes in the ocean, changes in the atmosphere. So very, very briefly, climate model could be defined as a mathematical representation of the climate system that's based on physical, biological, and chemical principles. Question, why do we need climate models? Basically, for a better understanding of the processes that happen in the atmosphere, then obviously to create plausible scenarios for scientific understanding, and also to plan for the future. So I'll just skip this. These are just some basic equations for the atmosphere. It's very complicated. And I'll go, so just one slide to tell you about the sort of computational requirements, like a 10-year-old global atmospheric simulation, like this is atmospheric general saturation model. Even the best supercomputer today, 10-year simulation takes several hours, several tens of hours, even if that machine has something like 1 gigaflop, 10^9 floating operations per second. So now we'll come to our discussion, the most influential climate change paper of all time. In July 2015, there was a survey conducted among researchers, lead authors, and review editors, and the following question was asked: what do you consider to be the most influential paper in the field of climate change? And the clear winner was, of course, the paper titled Thermal Equilibrium of the Atmosphere with a Given Distribution of Relative Humidity, published in 1967 in Journal of Atmospheric Sciences. The paper was written by Professor Manabe and Richard Weatherland. So the paper that has led to the award of the Nobel Physics Prize in 2021 to Professor Manabe of GFDL Princeton. GFDL stands for Geophysical Fluid Dynamic Lab at Princeton. So the above work was the first to represent the fundamental elements of the Earth's climate in a computer model to explore what doubling carbon dioxide would contribute to the global temperature. So the Manabe and Weatherall paper is considered as a pioneering effort in the field of climate modeling, one that effectively opened the door to projecting future climate change. Now there are 3 eminent experts who have contributed enormously to the IPCC report. Professor Foster of Leeds University. His comment is, this was really the first physically sound climate model, allowing accurate predictions of climate change. Its results are still valid today. Often when I have to think, I've done a new bit of research work, I found that it has already been included in this paper. Then Professor Sherwood of University of New South Wales says the paper was the first proper computation of global warming and stratospheric cooling from enhanced greenhouse gas concentration, including atmospheric emission and water vapor feedback. Professor Harvey of the University of Toronto says the paper was the first to assess the magnitude of the water vapor feedback and was frequently cited for a good 20 years after it was published. So right now I will just, for a moment, I will stop sharing, and then I request you to look at the board. Can you all see the board? Can you see the board? Okay, so this, I'll just give you some very brief background about radiation. Now we have the Earth, its radius is RP. Okay. Now we have the radiation coming from the sun. Now we know that now if RP is the radius of the Earth, pi RP squared is basically the cross-sectional area of the radiation coming from the sun. And S0 is a solar constant, which is a value of 1370 watts per meter squared. And if I assume AP is a planetary albedo, that means assuming a value of 0.3, that means 30% of the incoming solar radiation is reflected back by the Earth and its atmosphere. So basically S0 into 1 minus AP multiplied by pi RP squared is the total amount of energy that is received by the planet Earth from the sun. And obviously the amount of energy received must be equal to the amount of energy that is radiated. Now, so the Earth is going to radiate from all of its surface area, which is 4 pi RP squared. So sigma T power 4 multiplied by 4 pi RE squared is going to be the total amount of energy radiated out. So from this we can find out what is going to be the temperature of the Earth in terms of its emission, and that works out to 255 Kelvin. Now we all know that 255 Kelvin is not the planet temperature. The planet temperature is typically of the order of 15 degrees centigrade, which is 288 Kelvin. Now here what we have assumed that the atmosphere is completely passive in a sense that it allows all incoming radiation from the sun, completely transparent except for the part that is to do with the reflecting part, the albedo part. And as far as the outgoing long-wave radiation is concerned, it assumes that is again transparent. So because of that, we get a very, very low value of 255 Kelvin. So it's clear that the atmospheric planet temperature is not going to be so easy to calculate. So then we go for an improvement over this. What is the improvement? We have not considered here the greenhouse gases. Like for example, we have not considered the greenhouse effect. So let us look at this improvement. Now, if you look at this left panel, I have assumed here I have an atmosphere, a single layer. The atmosphere is now idealized as a single isothermal layer. So I have, this is the top of the atmosphere, this is the Earth's surface. Now I will assume that F units are incident at the top of the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is completely transparent to the incoming solar radiation. So what is received at the Earth's surface is going to be F. Now if I assume that the atmosphere to be completely opaque, in a sense that it completely absorbs all radiation radiated from the Earth, and then now I look at how is this planet temperature getting affected. So obviously for radiative equilibrium at the top of the atmosphere, F units are incident from the sun. So F units must be lost to space. Okay, so that is requirement of the radiative balance at the top of the atmosphere. Now I have considered this atmosphere as a single isothermal layer. So if F units of radiant energy are radiated upward, the same amount of F units will have to be radiated downward to the Earth. Now if F units are being radiated downward, we have now two F units that are being incident on the Earth's surface. F units coming from the sun and F units coming from the overlying atmosphere. So two F units are being received by the Earth's surface, and in order for the Earth's surface to be in radiative balance, we need the Earth's surface to radiate 2 F units. So 2 F units the Earth has to radiate essentially would mean that in my calculations, in the right hand side I have to multiply a factor of 2. That would mean that now my emitting temperature of the planet Earth is going to be 303 Kelvin and not 255 Kelvin. Now again we have overshot. The actual planet temperature is 288 Kelvin. Now we got a value of 303 Kelvin. Now the reason for this is not difficult to guess. One is assuming single isothermal layer is not a good approximation of the atmosphere. So let us look at, we divide the atmosphere into 2 layers. Okay, again 2 isothermal layers. So you can, for simplicity, you can assume this is my troposphere and this is my stratosphere. Now again I have F units incident from the sun. They are received at the top of the atmosphere. Okay, the atmosphere is completely transparent to the incoming solar radiation. So what is received at the top of the troposphere is F units. what is received as the incoming solar radiation at the Earth's surface is also F units. Okay, so now again, looking at the radiative equilibrium at the top of the atmosphere, now F units are incoming, so F units will have to leave the top of the atmosphere. Then only you can have radiative balance. Now, if F units are going to be radiated upward by the upper layer of the atmosphere, F units will have to be radiated downward, right? So the bottom of the upper layer is receiving F units from the overlying atmosphere and F units from the sun. So effectively, it's using 2 F units. For radiative equilibrium, it has to radiate 2 F units upward. If it radiates 2 F units upward, it will have to radiate 2 F units downwards. So the Earth's surface in turn receives F units from the sun and 2 F units from the overlying atmosphere, effectively getting 3 F units. In order to have radiative balance at the Earth's surface, the Earth's surface will now have to radiate 3 F units. 3 F units works out, you have a temperature of 335 Kelvin. Surely something is wrong here. We have assumed the atmosphere to be completely opaque, which it is not. So we have some constituents of the atmosphere, like water vapor has a strong absorption band at 6.3 micrometer. Carbon dioxide has a strong absorption band at 15 micrometer. And ozone has a reasonably strong absorption band at 9.6 micrometer. These are all infrared part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So we'll have to not take this entire atmosphere to be completely opaque. We'll have to look at what is the absorption coefficient of these gases, what is the amount of these gases, and do the actual radiative calculation. There is one more thing which I want to highlight here. Now, for example, if with 2 layers, I got 3 raised to the power 1/4 into 255, I got 335. Suppose I have, let's say, a 15-layer model. A 15-layer model would require 16 power 1/4. Which is going to be 2 times 255. That's going to be 510 Kelvin. Surely such temperatures we don't have. So what is it that so if we are going to have surface temperature of 303, 335 and all, we know that the overlying atmosphere is a fluid. So obviously we have a situation where fluid is heated from below. So obviously convection has to come into play. Now, so the essential point is the equilibrium temperature of the atmosphere as well as the surface of the planet Earth cannot be purely determined only by radiative processes. That's the first thing we have to understand. Okay. Now, let me now go back and share this. This is what I just explained. All those things are there here. Okay. So if I look and try to obtain the temperature profile of the atmosphere purely through radiative processes, then I get a temperature profile like this. Now, what are the observations we can make about this profile? One is the troposphere is very, very cold. It's like close to minus 80 degrees centigrade, and you have a very, very sharp decrease in the temperature with height. Okay. And so one observation is the close to the Earth's surface, the temperatures are very warm. Near the tropopause, temperatures are very cold. And the temperature profile, the lapse rate, the decrease of temperature with height is very, very, very steep if you take into radiation only. So obviously, as I indicated, convection is an important contributor to the energetics of the atmosphere. So convection we will have to take into account. Now, once we take into account convection, so we'll just go in 2 steps. One is we'll consider dry air. Okay. So there is this concept of partial stability. So I'll just try to quickly brief this. Suppose I have a parcel of dry air. Okay. And suppose that is displaced upward. Now, if the conditions of the atmosphere are such that the parcel comes back to the original position, then we say the atmosphere is stable. If the conditions of the atmosphere are such that the parcel moves further and further away from its original position, we say the atmosphere is unstable. And when we have the third situation where there is neither a tendency to come back to its original position, nor is a tendency to move further away from its original position, we say the atmosphere is neutral. So these are basically given by criteria in which we have gamma, which is the actual lapse rate of the atmosphere, decrease of atmosphere temperature with height. Gamma adiabat is basically the the what's called the dry adiabatic lapse rate. So if I have a dry parcel of air and it is subjected to an upward adiabatic motion, this parcel is going to cool by 9.8 degrees centigrade. Now the question is, why should this parcel cool? As it goes up adiabatically, it's going to expand because it encounters lower and lower pressure. Now, so the energy is required for this to perform this work of expansion. And because we are assuming the process to be adiabatic, it doesn't get any energy from the environment, from the surroundings. So it has to use its own internal energy. And if I assume that the atmosphere is an ideal gas, internal energy is a function of temperature only. So taking its own internal energy effectively means the parcel cools. Now it turns out that this dry adiabatic lapse rate is basically a constant. It's given by G by Cp. G is the acceleration due to gravity and Cp is the specific heat at constant pressure. 9.8 by 1004, you get 9.8 degrees per kilometer. So radiation alone cannot determine this. So what happens is, so clearly, if you have an atmosphere that is driven only by radiative processes, we have seen that the lapse rate is very, very steep. This gamma is very steep. Gamma greater than gamma adiabat, which is 9.8 degrees centigrade per kilometer. The atmosphere is unstable. So clearly, since the tropospheric lapse rate from purely radiative equilibrium is greater than the dry adiabatic lapse rate, the radiative equilibrium is said to be an unstable situation. So once the radiative equilibrium is unstable, then we introduce this concept of radiative dry convective equilibrium, where so once it is unstable, so this instability we'll assume is now being removed by convection. So convection immediately manifests and transports this air parcel upward through convection, and because of that, it will not allow the tropospheric lapse rate to exceed the dry adiabatic lapse rate. Am I making myself clear? So in this radiative, basically radiation and convection play a role. We call it dry convection because we are dealing with dry air. Okay, so wherever this neutrality doesn't exist, then radiation and convection act in concert, act in cooperative manner to restore neutrality. So the vertical temperature profile resulting from this equilibrium is better than purely obtained from radiative processes only. So the top panel shows you the dotted line is basically the actual temperature profile of the atmosphere, and the red one is the temperature profile obtained by purely radiative processes. As I told you, you have a very, very sharp decrease of temperature with height. Now, if I add dry convective equilibrium, so now I get a profile that is far better than purely radiative equilibrium. So still I have some issues. The temperature is still not warm enough as is seen in the real atmosphere. So then I go for a further improvement. The further improvement is, we know that the atmosphere is not dry. It is actually moist. It has water vapor, and water vapor plays a very, very important role. So the next improvement comes in what is called a moist convection. So unlike the dry air, which cools at a rate of 9.8 degrees centigrade per kilometer. So if you have a saturated air parcel and that is displaced vertically upward adiabatically, it's also going to cool, but then it is already saturated. So if you displace it and cools it, so it will, relative humidity will cross 100%. The excess moisture will undergo change of phase. Water vapor will become condensed into liquid water. There will be release of latent heat of condensation. Because of the release of latent heat of condensation, any saturated parcel that is going up is going to cool at a lower rate as compared with a dry parcel. So it turns out that this gamma moist adiabatic lapse rate is always less than the dry adiabatic lapse rate. So if you consider moist convection, then we say that the resulting equilibrium is what is called radiative moist convective equilibrium or radiative moist equilibrium. So again, you have the same situation. Whenever you have a situation, the tropospheric temperature lapse rate from radiative convective equilibrium under dry adiabatic condition is always greater than the moist adiabatic lapse rate. This enables us to introduce the concept of radiative moist convective equilibrium, or hereby called simply radiative convective equilibrium, where radiative and moist convective heating processes interact to result in equilibrium RN. So just looking at this, so now if I introduce radiative moist convective equilibrium, so this dotted one is I am giving my talk, I'll talk later. Okay. I'm sorry. So now you can see the red one is the one which we get with the radiative moist kinematic equilibrium. So we can see that it's much better. So just for completeness, we are showing the blue one is the purely radiative equilibrium. The next one, the maroon one, is radiative plus dry kinematic equilibrium, and the third one is radiative with moist kinematic equilibrium. So this gives us a sense that radiation as well as convection, especially moist convection, plays a very important role in determining the equilibrium temperature of the Earth atmospheric system. And this is the fundamental crux of the contribution of Professor Manabe. So I'll just get into some more details about this work. Now he used, so before that I'll have to define a couple of things. One is the relative humidity. All of you know what it is. It's expressed as a percentage. It's actually the ratio of the actual vapor pressure of a sample of air divided by the saturation vapor pressure of the same sample at the same temperature. Now we all know in high school we have studied that the saturation vapor pressure is an increasing function of air temperature, and this relationship is given by your Clausius-Clapeyron equation. So in a sense, the relative humidity, because it is E by ES and ES is a function of temperature, it is a temperature dependent quantity. Okay, there are other measures of moisture in the atmosphere. One of them is called the absolute humidity. It is simply defined as the mass of water vapor in a unit volume of air. So it's expressed as gram per meter cube. Now, the absolute humidity is a measure of water vapor or a measure of moisture in the atmosphere that is not temperature dependent. Now, I will tell you what is the critical difference between these two. And the spectacular results which Professor Manabe got in his paper of 1967 owe a lot to the fact that he used the relative humidity and not absolute humidity. Okay. I'll just quickly go across and tell some history of in the literature what is the sort of research that happened in atmospheric greenhouse effect. I was myself pleasantly surprised to know that the greenhouse effect was known nearly 200 years back. Joseph Fourier actually found that radiation emitted downward from the atmosphere, which contributed to increase of the Earth's surface temperature. So the greenhouse effect, we are all thinking, we have been hearing about it last 50 years. So this was known more than 200 years back. And 1860, John Tyndall actually showed that the major constituents of the Earth's atmosphere, like nitrogen and oxygen, that sort of contribute something like 98% of the total atmospheric mass, do not really contribute to the greenhouse gases. So it is only the minor constituents like CO2 that play a major role in the greenhouse effect. So this was all known in 1860s, that's like 150 years back. Now we all know that because of this presence of the greenhouse gases, the Earth's planet temperature is now higher by about 33 degrees. So we have seen that 258 to 288. So the first quantitative estimate of the effect of doubling of that atmospheric CO2 and how it impacts the mean surface temperature of the Earth was made by Arrhenius in 1896. That's also this was very surprising to me. People more than 120 years back, somebody actually, gave a hypothesis and gave a quantitative measure of how much is the Earth's planet temperature going to rise if I double the amount of CO2. Now, in fact, so the results of Arrhenius led to, if you double the atmospheric CO2, the Earth's surface temperature would increase by 6 degrees centigrade. So thankfully, he was way off the mark. So otherwise, it would have been a very panic situation for all of us. Because as we know, presently the carbon dioxide has got a value around 420 parts per million. So it had a value around 280 about 150 years back. So even though it has not doubled, so it has been a very dramatic increase in the last 150 years. So after the research of Arrhenius, there were other researchers who followed up. They improved the estimate by improving, making more accurate measurements of the radiative properties of the gases and improved the models, discretized the atmosphere into more number of layers. And then in 1963, Fritz Muller, he published a paper in Journal of Geophysical Research, and he found something troubling. So he said that calculation of surface temperature changes, that is surface temperature of the planet Earth, due to a doubling of carbon dioxide were extremely sensitive to the model assumptions. So if he changes the model assumptions, then he was getting a different answer. So he thought this model is not going to really throw any light on the actual magnitude of the increase of the planet surface temperature with doubling of CO2. And he went on to write in the paper, the theory that climate variations are affected by variation in the CO2 content itself becomes very questionable. So he took a very, very despondent view of the whole thing. But quickly, 4 years later, 1967, we have this paper of Manabe and Weatherland. They came to the rescue with the paper published in Journal of Atmospheric Science. So Manabe and Weatherland were convinced that radiation from the sun, now we know that sun is the source of all energy that drives the atmospheric circulation. So obviously, so he believed, Manabe believed just the radiation from the sun, and we all know that the greenhouse effect is important. But he felt that other than these two also there are factors that are important and they are contributing to the surface temperature. Now this was a very, very different thinking. The other important thinking that was contributed by Manabe and Weatherland was both the planet Earth surface and its overlying atmosphere are a single system. So we cannot sort of distinguish between the Earth and its atmosphere. So this was another very important contribution on that. So basically, they are so strongly coupled. The Earth's planet surface temperature and the overlying atmospheric temperature are very strongly coupled. So this was another major contribution of them. And then obviously they also incorporated other effects which were not considered by the others. Like for example, the others had dealt only with radiation. So they went ahead and included convection. The moist convective process, whatever I had discussed, that was considered by Manabe and Weatherland in the 1967 papers. And they also allowed for, they also realized that that you also have to not only deal with sensible transport of heat from the Earth's surface to the overlying atmosphere, you will also have to handle the latent heat. Like we know that we have evaporation from the oceans, then we have transpiration from plants. And so basically these get manifested as the moisture in the atmosphere. During cloud formation, they undergo change of phase and huge amount of latent heat of condensation is released. So this is a very, very important role played by water vapor when it changes phase from vapor to liquid. So these effects will have to be considered. So they considered all these effects. They just not considered just only the CO2, the greenhouse effect, and the sun, the output from the sun. So they considered many other things, like for example, convection, moist convection. They considered the latent heat of condensation and release, and so they put more emphasis on the physical aspects. And they also introduced a very simple algorithm, which is known as convective adjustment. So this is in some sense what I was telling you. If I have the lab state, the atmosphere through purely radiative equilibrium has a lab state that is much more sharper than what it is, then so I said then the whole thing situation becomes unstable, and then stabilizing effect of that is brought about by convection, dry convection. And once the atmospheric lab state is actually exceeding the moist adiabatic lab state, again the moist convection comes into play. So this they introduced as using a simple algorithm called convective adjustment. So this convective adjustment, essentially the atmospheric temperatures at various levels in the atmosphere were adjusted in such a way that whenever it crossed a certain critical limit, the critical limit they said was 6.5 degrees centigrade per kilometer. Once any region in the atmosphere crossed this critical limit, they will ensure that the convection would manifest and it will bring it back to 6.5 degrees centigrade, which will neutralize it and make it pseudo-adiabatic. So this was the most major contribution. I will quickly highlight some of their actual results. So one is for pure radiative equilibrium at the top of the atmosphere, you will want basically incoming solar radiation to be exactly equal to the outgoing solar radiation, as well as you would want the same at the Earth's surface. Now, when you come for thermal equilibrium, which is radiative plus thermodynamic equilibrium, that means both convection and radiative equilibrium. So at the top of the atmosphere, we would expect the incoming to be equal to the outgoing. But at the Earth's surface, because we are allowing convection, there's going to be a loss of loss of heat energy at the Earth's surface, because there's going to be because convection is essentially a process by which heat is going to be transported from Earth's surface and lower layers of the atmosphere to upper layers of the atmosphere. So at the Earth's surface, you should have incoming solar radiation should exceed the outgoing longer radiation, and this difference should be accounted for by the loss of heat by the Earth's surface due to convective process. And the third requirement, according to Manabe, was that whenever the lab state is subcritical, then we don't have to bring in convection. When it's supercritical, you bring in moist convection and make the lab state equal to 6.5. So this is what. So the procedure of convective adjustment is to adjust the lab state to the critical lab state. Manabe considered this to be 6.5 degrees centigrade per kilometer. So whenever the critical lab state gets exceeded in the course of numerical integration. Okay. So the most important idea which Manabe got was this figure 1, which he shows in his 1967 paper. This is for northern hemisphere. So in the upper panel tells you how the latitude height distribution of relative humidity is changing. This is for the summer situation, typically the month of June in the northern hemisphere. And bottom panel tells you the conditions, the latitude height distribution of relative humidity over the entire northern hemisphere during the winter month, typically December. Now what he noticed was there is not much difference between summer and winter, right? So here you have values near about 50% relative humidity. Here also you have 50%. So summer and winter does not seem to have much effect, because we expect 24 hours of sunlight in summer, 24 hours of darkness in winter. So again, similarly close to the equator, so the variation was from 80 to 60 degrees till 4 kilometer. The variation was 80 to 50 kilometer, 50% for the same height in the winter. So there's not much difference. So this is a zonal mean distribution of relative humidity for 2 seasons in northern hemisphere. His first observation was these are closely resembling one another. So he thought this is going to be a better parameter to choose in his model than the absolute humidity, because this was critical. This was dependent on temperature. Okay, so that was his biggest contribution. And so the left panel shows you the role of convective adjustments. So you can see these 3 profiles. The y-axis is the pressure, and the right-hand side is your altitude in kilometers, and you have the temperature. So this gives you the equilibrium temperature for 3 situations. One situation is I have only radiative equilibrium where I have the relative humidity. So that is exactly this. The one which has the steepest temperature drop. So that I'm considering only radiative processes, assuming given the initial profile of relative humidity. Then the second profile was, so I am now adding convection also, but I am using one absolute humidity, not the relative humidity. So that is the second profile. So that is also giving rise to a very cold tropopause, and the tropopause height is also very less. And then if I have both radiation and convection, and then I use relative humidity, then I get this third profile, which is the best among all the 3. Okay. And then the right panel actually tells you if he uses relative humidity, he gets the solid line. So the x-axis is nothing but solar constant for different values of solar constant. The units here are basically Lumley per minute. So one solar constant is equal to 2 Lumley per minute. And the y-axis are basically the temperatures in Kelvin. Now what you see here is the continuous line is basically when he uses the relative humidity is given, and the dashed line is when he uses absolute humidity. If you recall, absolute humidity is a measure of moisture which is not dependent on temperature. Relative humidity is a measure of moisture which is dependent on temperature. So when he uses relative humidity, he finds that for a certain change in solar constant, the change in the equilibrium temperature, okay, over that change in solar constant is at least twice as large as if you use absolute humidity. So if you use relative humidity, he found that the change in the equilibrium temperature is much more sensitive than for a change in the solar constant as compared with absolute humidity. Now this was also why he decided to choose relative humidity. Then the left panel here shows you for a fixed relative humidity profile, higher values of solar constant lead to higher air temperature under radiative convective equilibrium. So for now left y-axis is your pressure and altitude, x-axis is your surface temperature. So basically this is the temperature profile, equilibrium temperature. If I use 2, that would correspond to 1 solar constant. So if he artificially increases the solar constant from 2 to 2.2, 2.4, 1.8, 1.6, 1.2, these are the sort of equilibrium temperatures he's getting. So larger the solar constant, larger is the input from the sun, higher is your basically equilibrium temperature of the troposphere and the surface of the planet Earth, as well as your stratosphere. So that is his basic conclusion. Then for various relative humidity profiles, values at the Earth's surface. So the right panel tells you the vertical distribution of radiative convective equilibrium temperatures for various distribution of relative humidity. So he used relative humidity 100% at the Earth's surface. He used relative humidity is 60%. He used relative humidity is 20% at the Earth's surface. Then he found the equilibrium. So these are all results of his model. Okay, I'm not going to get into the details of the model. So essentially, what he found was if you have higher relative humidity values, so you find that the equilibrium temperature of the atmosphere as well as the equilibrium temperature of the planet Earth's surface is higher if you use higher relative humidity. More the relative humidity, more is going to be the equilibrium temperature of your atmosphere. Now this makes sense because we know that water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. So larger the amount of moisture content in the atmosphere, larger is going to be your greenhouse effect in that sense. So obviously that will also contribute to your equilibrium temperature. So the increase in the tropospheric temperature and increase in the surface planet temperature due to the increase in moisture content also was a consistent result. So I think I'm running out of time. I'll skip some of those figures. So the left panel tells you basically the upward long wave radiation at the top of the atmosphere and the upward long wave radiation bottom of the atmosphere for different surface temperatures. And this is the most important thing. So the right panel tells you the vertical distribution of temperature in radiative convective equilibrium for various CO2 mixing ratio values. Mixing ratio is simply the mass of carbon dioxide to the mass of dry air. So 150 parts per million, that means, so basically the mass of CO2 is 150 divided by 10 power 6 unitless. So that is the amount of CO2 typically. So that essentially means it has got something like point. So 150 by 10 power 6 would mean 15 by 10 power 5. So 0.15 by 1000. So that means it is something like if I take 1 kilogram of dry air, so the carbon dioxide will be 0.15 grams. So that is nice. So if I have 150 parts per million, now we know carbon dioxide is around 410 to 420 parts per million in the present atmosphere. So 150 parts per million, if you have, then you are going to get a temperature profile like this. If you are having 330 parts per million, you're going to have the temperature like that. And if you're going to have double it to 600, you're going to have like this. So the result was higher mixing ratio of CO2 value. More the CO2, warmer is the equilibrium surface temperature of the planet, and warmer is the temperature of the troposphere, and colder is the equilibrium temperature of the stratosphere. So Manabe's paper 1967 was the first documentation that the doubling of carbon dioxide is, I mean, there were others who got, but his answers were more closer to the actual reality. I'll come to that. So higher the carbon dioxide content, more is going to be the increase of temperature in your troposphere, more is going to be the increase of the surface planet temperature, and more importantly, less is going to be the stratospheric temperature. So this was one of his results. So this, the 3 panels on the left show you the effect of clouds. So I will not spend too much time. So basically he considered the effect of high clouds, which are cirrus clouds, which lie between 6 kilometers and 9 kilometers. Not only the type of the clouds, at the height of the clouds, he also looked at different extents. All these 3 figures tell you that you have 100% coverage of the high clouds. Then you have something like 2 other lower values, like 30% and 60%. So this is 100, then 50 and 0. No clouds would correspond to clear skies. Then the middle panel tells you about the medium clouds that lie between 3 kilometers and 6 kilometers. And then the third panel tells you the low clouds that lie between 1 to 3 kilometers. Okay. So basically for different clouds at different heights and different cloudiness, that means the horizontal extent of the clouds, he was able to get the equilibrium temperature. One of his results is increasing low cloud extent, horizontal extent, increasing low and medium clouds actually cools the climate. So it reduces the temperature of the troposphere and then increasing the horizontal extent of the high clouds actually warms the climate. So this was also one of the results which we got. So effect of cloudiness typically, so you can see clear skies and average cloudiness. So you have a certain percentage of high clouds, certain percentage of medium clouds, certain percentage of low clouds. So what he found was when you add clouds, the equilibrium temperature of the atmosphere goes down, as well as the equilibrium temperature of the surface planet temperature. So this is something which was quite known and quite acceptable, because the moment you have clouds, what happens is they reflect some of the incoming radiation. And they also sometimes, depending on their nature and the height of the cloud, they either absorb the outgoing longer radiation or they are transparent to that. So obviously in all ways they actually contribute. Overall, they contribute to a reduction in the equilibrium temperature of the troposphere. So this is the most important table. So before Manabe, okay, variation in CO2 content from 150 to 300. So if you double the carbon dioxide content, use a given fixed absolute humidity profile in the atmosphere, and clear skies condition, you have 300 to 150. So you are halving the CO2. Then that contributes to a reduction of 1.5 degrees centigrade in your surface temperature. And so if you have average cloudiness, basically when you half the CO2 from 300 to 150 ppm, so the cooling or the reduction of temperature is only -1 degree. So obviously this was also consistent with what we got here. So moment you have clear skies and with clouds means the temperatures are lower. So that is exactly what we got here. But if you double from 300 to 600, so they got the same magnitude. 150 to 300, 600 to 300, we got the same. So 300 to 600, you double CO2, you have in clear skies 1.5 degrees. And if you add certain clouds, you have the increase of +1 degree. Okay, so when Manabe and Weatherland in their paper, if they use fixed absolute humidity profile, doubling CO2 from 300 to 600 yielded +1.36 under clear sky conditions and +1.33 under average cloudiness condition. But if you use relative humidity instead of absolute humidity, so you find that for average cloudiness, doubling CO2 from 300 to 600 increased the planet Earth temperature by 2.36 degrees centigrade. So this was the most remarkable result. And this table tells you the same thing. Only thing is you have to subtract 150. These are the values 289.8 under fixed average cloudiness, fixed absolute humidity. 300 is, so you have to subtract 291.05 minus 289.80. So you get this value. So this table is redundant because this tells you only the change in equilibrium temperature. So what this result tells us is, under average cloudiness condition, it is possible if you double the carbon dioxide content from 300 parts per million to 600 parts per million, the planet average temperature, the surface temperature of planet Earth will go up by 2.36 degrees. Now you compare with Arrhenius 1896, this increase was 6 degrees. Okay, so this is much less. Now the question is, how good is this compared with actual observation? So the contribution of Manabe and Weatherland, so I will go a little faster. So when they performed experiments with present and double CO2, they obtained a warming of 1.33 when specific humidity was fixed, but when relative humidity was fixed, they got 2.36. So just imagine they just changed one measure of humidity, which was not dependent on temperature, to another measure of humidity that depended on temperature. They got double the response. Instead of 1.33, they got almost double, 2.36. So the reason was relative humidity dependent on saturation vapor pressure, saturation vapor pressure dependent on air temperature. So the second estimate, 2.36 with relative humidity, incorporated the fact that there was a positive temperature water vapor feedback was also getting incorporated. The second estimate, considered more realistic, is well within the accepted value estimates reported by the fifth assessment report of the IPCC. So very, very importantly, unlike Moeller, who 4 years back in 1963 gave a conclusion that the warming of the planet Earth's temperature to doubling of CO2 was extremely sensitive to the model assumptions. So if we change the model assumptions, everything went wrong. But what happened was, in Manabe's work, he showed that there is no such extreme sensitivity to the model assumptions. So his results were more consistent. And the fallacy of the earlier work was that they considered the Earth's surface, planet Earth's surface, and the overlying atmosphere to be sort of decoupled. So Manabe rightly presumed that these two are very strongly coupled, and it is not just enough to look at the radiative balance at the Earth's surface. You'll also have to look at the radiative balance and the balance that ensues from radiative moist convective equilibrium at the atmosphere also. So there are other results also. The above itself is a very remarkable achievement. He got 2.36 degree increase in the surface planet temperature when you double CO2 from 300 to 600 parts per million. So additionally, he got that the temperature in the stratosphere actually cooled when you double the CO2. So this is also confirmed by observations over the last 50 years. So then he did many things. He increased the solar constant. As I told you, that increased the equilibrium temperature in the atmosphere as well as the planet's surface. Then he also increased the water vapor content in the stratosphere. So that also contributed to increase in the surface temperature of the Earth. So they also explained why the earlier results were inconsistent. So the question is, why is this paper so important? They were the first to include all the main physical processes relevant to the problem, using a model that was not more complicated than required to put in place all those physical processes. So it was not extraordinarily complicated model. So if you have extraordinarily complicated model, it is very, very difficult to interpret the results and to give physically illuminating arguments and hypotheses to further your objectives and your results. So the physics was so good that the model, even though it was not very complicated, it could bring out very, very accurate results. So that was the most important contribution of Manabe and Weatherman. So however, of course, after 1967, there were more realistic simulations were obtained because models got improved, and then you have coupled models that came into play. But however, the paper is still a watershed in the climate change research community because of its clarity and simplicity of the explanation of the results. So there have been further refinements in the atmospheric model since that paper, but the physical insights embodied in the model ensure that the changes they predicted and the explanation produced still hold good for more than half a century. Okay, this is one couple of more slides in Manabe thing. So basically, he did not venture to find out how much is the CO2 going to change, amount of CO2. Okay, so in 1967, there was a certain amount of CO2 present. He only said that if this CO2 gets doubled, what is going to be the increase in the planet's surface temperature? That is what was his contribution. So subsequently, in the next 50 years, from 1967 to 2016, people had 50 years of extra every year additional CO2 reserves. So what they did was they put in, so they plotted the temperature anomaly, basically the change in the planet Earth's temperature in the y-axis. In the x-axis is basically the CO2 concentration. CO2 concentration based on the actual observations. Those are the blue lines obtained from 6 different sources. So you have this blue line, and this red line is basically, if this was a CO2 in the year 1967, this is going to be the increase in the surface temperature of the planet Earth. So next year, 1968, this is going to be the CO2. They put the actual value into Manabe's model and then found out how much is going to be the increase. And that increase was the red line. Now the slope of the blue line, which is the actual observation, the increase of the surface temperature of the Earth because of the actual amount of CO2 present in the atmosphere, was the blue line, which had a slope of 2.57. And the red line was the result of Manabe's model. So if you put the actual value of CO2, how much is the increase of planetary surface temperature that you're getting. So that is your red line. So the blue line had a slope of 2.57. The red line had a slope of 2.36. Now this was after 50 years of consistent CO2 actual observation they put in. So you can see that the difference is less than 10%. 2.57 and 2.36. So with no idea how much the CO2 is going to increase. So the reason is very obvious. Once you have the physics, the right physics in your model, then the model is going to work, irrespective of the amount of CO2 is going to have. So another very interesting thing was in the 2 decades that preceded this paper, 1967, there was hardly any rapid increase in the CO2. Okay, so there was no detectable warming in nearly 2 decades, in nearly 20 years, because there was no great increase in CO2. So to imagine and to put forward a model which has all the physics in the right what I should say perspective. So this actually tells you the blue one is basically the observations of CO2 in the x-axis and the temperature increase in the y-axis, and this is a sort of mean curve, and the red one is Manabe's result. So from 1967, how much is going to be the increase in the temperature of the planet Earth surface vis-a-vis the increase in the CO2 content. So this actually you can test here. So again you can see here. So this blue line is actual observation. The red line is Manabe's result, and the blue continuous line is basically the observation. So you can say that. So for 50 years, this model, despite its simplicity, has done really well. So I will just stop here for Professor Manabe and just quickly wrap up the Professor Hasselmann. So basically, we know climate is a multi-scale system in which different physical processes act on different temporal and spatial scales. For example, in the micro scale, we have turbulent eddies that are present in the atmosphere with time scales of the order of seconds to minutes. Then we have the mesoscale, which is typically the convection, and with time scale of hours to days. And then we have the synoptic scale. These are what are called the extratropical cyclones or the depressions. So these have time scales that vary from days to weeks. And then we have the large scale Rossby waves and teleconnection pattern. They have the time scales of weeks to seasons. So in the atmosphere, we have a wide range of scales that starts from the turbulent eddies right up to the Rossby waves. If you go to ocean, you have the coupled ocean atmospheric system with time scales of seasons to decades. So if you take climate, then obviously the atmosphere is a component of climate system. The ocean is a component of the climate system. So basically, within the atmosphere itself, you have varying scales of motions of varying horizontal extent as well as varying time scales. So basically, all these processes are happening in widely different temporal and spatial scales, and they interact with one another due to the inherent nonlinearity of the climate system. So the contribution of Professor Hasselmann was that he was from the Max Planck Institute of Meteorology. He was the director of the institute from 1975 to 2000. And in 1976, he published a paper called Stochastic Climate Theory. It was a single author paper, which was published in the journal TELUS. So he was the first to provide an alternate model, and he demonstrated what did he actually achieve in that paper. Now you have the climate, right? So we can have variability of the climate. So he was able to demonstrate and show that the variability of the climate, okay, can be brought about by aggregation of short-term weather fluctuations. So the variability in climate was not brought about because of some instability in the climate system. It was not brought about because the external boundary conditions were changing. So what Professor Hasselmann proposed and demonstrated was that, so you can have changes in the climate that are due to large-scale fluctuations of the weather. Now we know that the weather changes so fast and the climate changes very slowly. Now, how the climate variability can be driven by fluctuations in the weather system. This was something nobody really comprehended, but he proposed a theory which is called the stochastic climate theory. Okay, so essentially what he did was, so he was able to demonstrate the variability of climate to internal random forcing by the short time scale weather component of the system. So in effect, so if you look at all these different systems, now we have the weather, the atmosphere, which changes very rapidly. So we call it a fast response system. Then we have the ocean that responds very slowly. It has got a much larger time scale that can run into decades and maybe hundreds of years or thousands of years if you take the thermohaline circulation into consideration. So he basically, I'll just go into complete this. So the instantaneous state of the complete system of the atmospheric, ocean, cryosphere, land, he defined as a finite set of discrete variables Z, comprising of Z1, Z2. All these are basically dependent variables of either the atmosphere or the ocean or the cryosphere or the land. So this is a state vector. It is taken to represent the fields of density, velocity, temperature of various medium and defined at discrete grid points and levels. So he looked at the evolution of this state vector. So dzi by dt equal to wiz. Now wi is some nonlinear complicated function of z. So the basic assumption of Hasselmann was that this z, this complete state vector, the climate state vector, can be divided into subsystems. So z can be divided into x and z can be and y. Now x is characterized by the fast response, rapidly changing, rapidly fluctuating weather elements, and y is the slowly responding and slowly varying climate variable. So from the state vector, he derived two subsystems for the variation of the rapid component of the weather elements dxi by dt is equal to ui, which is going to be a function of both the rapidly varying x as well as slowly varying y. And similarly, dy by dt, this is a slowly varying climate. So this is a climate variability. So that again depends both, not just exclusively on climate variables, it also depends on x variables in very general terms. And the basic assumption was this subsystem x has a response time tau x, and the subsystems y has a response time tau y. And fast response tau x is much less compared with the slow response tau y. So the fast responding components xi may be identified with the normal prognostic weather variables used in deterministic numerical weather prediction. Whereas the slowly responding climate variables may be associated with variables such as sea surface temperature, ice coverage, land foliage that represent essentially the prognostic variables on a climatic timescales. So tau x is of the order of a few days because this is weather, it can change sharply. Tau y is of the order of months, years, or even longer. So it's not possible with the present available computers to integrate the complete coupled system of equations over a period of the climatic timescale. We can't run it for 1,000 years. The complete climate system. High resolution global circulation models, general circulation models are typically used to integrate and find out to solve the first subset of equation. That means dxi by dt. So that means basically how the weather elements evolve in time. And these are run for an intermediate period which is larger than the response time of the atmosphere. The intermediate time is tau t, which is lying between tau x and tau y. So during this intermediate period tau t, so we can fairly assume that the climate variables y are held fixed. They don't change much during that intermediate period. So this tau t may be something of the order of a season or less than a year, one should say. So the climate variables y can be regarded as constant for this time period tau t, but which is still sufficiently long to define the statistics of the weather variables x for a given climatic state y. So this is GCM, which tells you how to solve the weather elements. Then you have another set of models called statistical dynamical models, which solve the second set, basically the climate set. And they are known as statistically dynamic models, SDMs. So they address the second set of coupled models. So that means they try to solve those equations dyi by dt is equal to vi of xy. In SDMs, it's argued that for the timescales of interest, that means for the entire climatic timescales, the rapidly fluctuating terms in the prognostic equations the rapidly fluctuating terms that correspond to the fast response weather elements can be ignored. Because when you talk of climate variability, you don't really have to take into consideration if you are going to integrate over thousands of years, the fast changing weather, which is going to change every few days, is not going to impact on what is going to, manifest in a climate variability which is running into hundreds of years. So it's possible to ignore totally the rapidly fluctuating terms in the prognostic equation, and such equations are known as statistical dynamical models. So the contribution of Hasselmann was to find an intermediate model between one extreme, which is the GCM, which solves the fast response weather equations, and the statistical dynamical model which solve the basically which solve the climate, which address the climate variability. He brought an intermediate model which is known as stochastic climate models. I will not get into too much details. So effectively his whole idea was this. So as you know, basically the GCMs I can run for a season, let's say 3 months, or the monsoon season 4 months, June to September. Now the statistical dynamical model we can run for, let's say, 1 decade, 10 years or hundreds of years. Then coming to the stochastic climate models, Hasselmann argued that these are typically run for a timescales that are intermediate between the fast response weather models and the long range statistical dynamical models. So these are typically integrated up to a certain distance. So the most important contribution was he was able to demonstrate and show that even if I integrated, let's say for 5 years or 10 years, the stochastic climate models, he can represent the fluctuating weather elements which are fast response as random noise into his model. And then because of this manifestation, modeling of this short range weather fluctuations as random noise into his intermediate stochastic climate model, he was able to demonstrate and show that this random noise introduced as fast response weather fluctuations do actually contribute to variability in the climate. If you run this so-called stochastic climate models for an intermediate period, which lies much above the timescales that are required for weather and which are much less than the timescales required for climate. So that was his greatest contribution. So I will just show this one figure. So this is from one of his. So the blue line actually tells you. So the x-axis is years, and the y-axis is the observations observing actual change in the surface temperature of the planet Earth. So his theory also he used in climate change research, and the blue line basically tells you how much the surface temperature is going to change due to natural variability of the climate system. And the other color, the red one actually tells you how the surface temperature of the planet Earth is going to change if you had the natural plus the anthropogenic, that is a human-induced climate effects into his climate model. And the black one is basically the observed change in the planet surface temperature. So you can see very clearly the human being has made a very big impact and into the contributed to the global warming of the planet Earth. That's very abundantly clear. So if it were only natural, if the change in the planet Earth's surface temperature were due to only natural variation, natural causes, it will follow this blue line, which is not really shown a very. But if you see from 1960, there is a pronounced increase in the magnitude of the surface temperature of planet Earth, mostly because of human-induced anthropogenic activities. So I think I will stop here. So just in conclusion, Hasselmann and Manabe have both developed models that address fundamental questions about how the climate works and how it changes. Manabe and Hasselmann are two giants in climate science that really shaped and in some way started climate science. So I will end my talk here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Chandrasekhar, for very enlightening talk, actually going to the very detail of those modeling part. Now, forum is open for questions.
Yeah, Professor, say they don't consider black body radiation of Earth.
Yeah. So they consider various things. Yes. After all, no. Like if you take, for example, the Earth surface, okay, it is radiating typically in the infrared part of the spectrum. That means
Yes.
from
Right.
4 micrometer to 100 micrometer.
Right.
Over this range, what's called the thermal radiation, the maximum, like from the Wien's displacement law, lambda mt is equal to 2897. So typically the average temperature of planet Earth is 288 Kelvin. So that corresponds means that the wavelength of maximum energy is around 10 micrometer, which is in the infrared part of the spectrum. So over this typical range of range of wavelengths in the infrared part of the spectrum, what is called the thermal radiation, one does accept and use that the Earth is a black body.
So I think in my mind that
No,
contributes.
but when it comes to clouds, when it comes to clouds, now whether you treat them as a black body, you will that again depends on what is the height at which the cloud is there, what is the sort of extent of the cloud, and what is the nature of the cloud. Does it have hydrometeors which are ice? Does it have hydrometeors which are only water? So many other factors come in.
Because Earth, what we are artificially emitting from our factories and other things, that also will contribute to black body radiation more, right? So compared to apart from light coming from sun, this also will radiation also will be contributed to that. That modeling also the people have these
So
people
that is basically increasing CO2 and increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is basically what is contributing to the increased planet surface temperature as well as the increased temperature in the atmosphere. Yeah, definitely the anthropogenic activities of human beings have really clearly, altered the planet surface temperature. That's why we are all worried. In fact, basically the increase in temperature, like a doubling of the CO2, you have about 2.5 degrees increase in temperature. This is going to increase the sea level. Now there are more interesting things. Like for example, we know that at high latitudes during winters, what happens is the ocean surface cools, and the cooled water becomes denser, and so it sinks. Okay, now so that sinking of the surface waters to the bottom of the oceans, and then it moves to lower latitudes and comes up. This is part of what's called the ocean circulation, which has got a time scale of 1,000 years. Now, because of global warming, what is worrying is because of global warming, all these glaciers and ice will melt. Because they melt, what will happen is the waters over these high latitudes, let's say Arctic Ocean, high latitude Atlantic, North Atlantic Ocean. So the water will become less saline because fresh water, ice melts, so it introduces fresh water. So the salinity or the salt content of the water will decrease. So once the salinity, more is the density. If the water becomes less saline, it's not going to be dense enough to sink. Now, if it doesn't sink, what happens? It affects the thermohaline circulation. Now, once the thermohaline circulation is affected, the transport of excess heat from those regions which have excess heat energy to those regions which have deficit energy is also going to get impacted. So this is because the circulation has a time scale of 1,000 years. We are not going to be there to live and see what is the consequence of our anthropogenic activities. So the challenge is there. So there is a fear that whatever activities we do today, one is 50 years we know the planet temperature is increased by this, but there are slower moving systems with slower responses like the ocean, and so if they get impacted, there's just no way we can correct it.
Yeah.
Any other question? Any more question?
Yeah, Professor Chandrasekhar, you are mentioning about a stochastic model. So they have So they have discussed both deterministic and stochastic.
Yeah. So basically, it's called stochastic, but it's actually a deterministic model. Okay, this is just a terminology. It's actually a deterministic model. The model proposed by Hasselmann is actually a deterministic model.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Any more questions?
There are no questions you can thank.
Yeah, so before I think Professor Chandrasekhar, just a general question. For
Yeah.
1967 to till today, how complicated has become the atmospheric or climate modeling? I mean, is it that the base structure is almost similar, or it's become really much more complicated?
Okay, so let me just tell about this contribution of Professor Manabe. So he has been, he has his early education in Tokyo. He's got his PhD from University of Tokyo sometime, I think, in the late 50s, and then he moved to US. And then he was a part of this geophysical fluid dynamics program. And if you see from the 60s, he's just contributing like anything. His research output is so prolific. So, like for example, GFDL is one institution which actually, is one of the strongest group of climate modelers, which was set up by its first director. There is one person called Smagoronsky. So, if you see the contribution of Manabe, one is he's got series of publications in the 60s. And like for example, in 1967 is this paper. If you look at 1965 is a paper, Manabe and Stickler, where they have introduced a hydrological cycle into their climate model. Then 1969, he introduced a coupled ocean atmospheric model with the help of his colleague, Professor Brian from GFDL. So he was the first to introduce a multi-model atmospheric and climate model. That was the first thing. Second is he was the first to introduce and understand the importance of convection. And then he introduced this concept of convective adjustment, which was a very important contribution. He also introduced hydrology cycle. He also introduced coupled ocean atmospheric circulation models. So he's been a very, very significant. So over the years, what has happened is the models have become very, very complex, very, very complicated. And because they have become very complicated, it's very, very difficult to sort of interpret the results. You don't really know this result is because of what factor we have changed. Okay, so it's become so complex that it has become so you just have like you have a model. You only know that so long as it gives reasonably good results, you are okay with it. So this sort of physically eliminating, modeling the physical processes and bringing out. So there may be much more complex models which possibly can give you a better results. He got like 2.36, maybe they're closer to 2.57. But then the sort of the greatness of his work lies in his simplicity.
Yeah.
He used a very simple model, put the right physics, and got extraordinarily good results, which have stood the test of time. I think that's where his contribution and his greatness and his research, really is. So these are people who have the intuition and they are very good in their physics and put the physics in the right way. And using very simple models, they are able to get extraordinarily good results.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that's also one reason why we don't get so many of such people.
Okay. So if there is no more question, let us thank Professor Chandrasekhar for his time and very enlightening lectures. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.